From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
One of the things that makes the Pacific Northwest region very unique is the degree of cooperation that takes place at multiple levels around bee health. This is, of course, happens at the research level, but also at extension, the organizations that work for bee health, but also just the beekeepers and bee enthusiasts around the region typically work together. I first became aware of this when I did my master's research under Dr. Mark Winston at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and there was already a dense network in place between BC, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, but also California. In this episode, we're going to learn of the origins of that network from Dr. Mike Burgett. Now, he's an emeritus professor at Oregon State University. He's been on the show a number of times in the past. Dr. Burgett was part of the creation of that network. He was kind of in the middle of it as it came about. And so we're going to go back to the 1980s, a period when growers didn't really use honeybees for crop pollination nearly the extent that they do now. There really wasn't an extension network to help beginning beekeepers who were taking up beekeeping as a hobby. But also there was the start of a kind of regional approach to bees and pesticides that only has matured over time. So without further ado, let's talk to Dr. Mike Burgett this week on Pollination.
I am pleased to welcome back for the third time to Pollination, Dr. Mike Burgett. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anthony.
Well, the other day, you and I were moving bees from Corvallis to the North Willamette Research and Extension Center, and we got talking about kind of the history of cooperative research and extension in the West, in the Pacific Northwest, but also with California. And I thought this would be a good occasion, as I kind of envisioned there's a lot of changes happening in the region to kind of revisit what was here before. And so I guess one of the things that I want to talk about is when you were hired in 1984, what was sort of the situation? What did the landscape of California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia look like?
With my hire in 1974, it had been many, many years since a dedicated apiculturist was on the OSU staff. Mm-hmm. So mine was, in essence, a new position. In the state of Washington, at Pullman at WSU was Dr. Carl Johansson, and Carl had been there since the early 1950s, or if not mid-1950s. But Carl's program concentrated on honeybee pesticide mortalities, mm-hmm. as well as working with leafcutter bees. So Carl had a world-recognized program in bee toxicology. Mm-hmm. Davis consisted of the bee lab with 3 research teaching positions plus a full-time extension apiculturist.
Oh, so the real center, at least before you were hired, was Davis.
Yes.
That was where everything was happening.
Right.
Okay.
But between Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, with the extension service, there was this realization that because we are in the Pacific Northwest and our geographic and climatic similarities between the 3 states, we had this joint extension publication system called PNWs, where it was not necessary for the state of Oregon to write a bulletin on how to keep bees and a separate bulletin for Washington and Idaho.
Because it makes sense. The region is so, why do you need to write a beginning beekeeping manual for 3 states when the beekeeping is similar across all 3 states?
So when I first came here, I connected with Carl Johansson, and Carl and I over the years had a series of PNW publications on tree fruit pollination, evaluating bee colonies for pollination, any number of things. And it was a nice, strong relationship.
Mhm.
We had no formal relationship with British Columbia, but we would often have, and Carl started this, and he and I continued it. We had what we called an every other year PNW bee school.
Ah,
And it would, every 4 years it was at OSU, and the next 2 years it was at WSU, and
Really?
then back here. And it was, it was 100% extension activity, and we would involve the relevant people from the state of California. Eric Musson, for example, is the extension apiculture.
who was also hired about the same time as yourself.
Shortly thereafter,
Okay, yeah.
in the mid-70s. And we would frequently involve BC people, John Corner, Doug McCutcheon. So again, it was in recognition that BC is so similar is part of the Pacific Northwest. Let's remove that Canadian border and just look at it from an environmental point of view and from a beekeeping point of view. So there were informal collaborations with the regulatory apiculture people in British Columbia.
But let me get this straight. The anchor were these kind of alternating meetings, these bee schools between
Right.
Washington.
Right.
Ah, okay, interesting.
And they were separate from the annual. Washington and Oregon would occasionally have joint state meetings of their beekeeping
Oh, I
association.
would hear about these like at Hood River.
Yes.
They would meet. Okay,
Yes.
yeah.
And they were kind of a takeoff from the PNW Bee School that Carl and I maintained. After a period of time, Carl and I just looked at budgets. We looked at a lot of things, and we decided, okay, we stopped it.
Mhm.
And then the WSBA and OSBA saw the wisdom in it and began having joint meetings.
Mm-hmm.
So there has always been this collaborative feeling between the two states and three states. Idaho is interesting because at the time, and I think it's probably still the case, they possessed the highest number of honeybee colonies.
Mhm.
Washington was number 2 and Oregon was number 3, but Idaho never had a dedicated apiculturist at an academic level.
Mhm.
So we would involve people in the Department of Entomology at the University of Idaho in terms of when we would write these joint bulletins, we would ask for their input in terms of editing and because again, the PNW series is Oregon, Washington, Idaho.
All right, so a couple things I just want to pick up on. The first one is that the other, I guess, hire of the time was my mentor and master supervisor, Mark Winston, who showed up and must have been about the same time he was hired at Simon Fraser University. Was sometime in the 80s.
Correct.
Had to be. And so there suddenly was a position at WSU, position at Simon Fraser. There was Eric Musson and your position. And it one of the things that you mentioned to me is one way that this group collaborated was what was newly formed at the time and still exists, the Western Apicultural Society meeting.
Correct. Dr. Norm Gary at UC Davis was, if you want to say, the father of WAS. And he, along with Eric, our first meeting of WAS was in 78 at Davis. The second meeting was 79, was here on the OSU campus. And then Mark Winston's program at Simon Fraser got involved. I'm not exactly sure how many WAS meetings took place up there, but for quite a lengthy period of time, I was in charge of finding next year's venue.
Mm-hmm.
So distinctly remember going to Mark and saying, "Hey, Mark, how about we have WAS in BC?" And Mark's graciously said, "Absolutely." So, and put on a great meeting there. But the Western Apiculture Society, you know, covered the Western U.S., but the largest number of participants would probably be California, and then Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. BC was involved. Nevada was involved. And it was originally the meetings were always to be held on a college campus, but logistics, that all came to a place. I remember when California was hosting one year, and Eric Musson was the president, we actually had it at a private venue. But WAS was great. You know, it was designed for non-commercial beekeepers, and it was a way that brought science of beekeeping, the extension aspects of beekeeping, into a 4-day focus every year.
And I guess one can't underestimate, you know, it's hard to imagine, but I experienced at least there was the memory of it, at least when I came on the scene in the 90s, of the 70s explosion of interest in beekeeping.
Yes.
There was a hobby beekeeping explosion akin to what we experienced over the last decade in the 70s.
Yes. I've been involved with bees now for, my God, I date it from my first day I walked into grad school at Cornell in Roger Morris's program, which was 1969. But I've seen several major pendulum swings in terms of the popularity of hobby beekeeping. And certainly the last decade, with the definition of colony collapse disorder and a much greater awareness on the lay public of the importance of bees in food production, that the hobby beekeeping has exploded. And I think when I came to Oregon, there were perhaps 5 local bee associations in the state, and I think right now there's something like 12. So I'm delighted to see that. My program when I first came was initially 100% research and teaching, and there was no extension component, but the OSU College of Agriculture Administration recognized that extension was a vital component. So I worked my program for, my God, something like 20 years with a memorandum of understanding that half of my research time is to be dedicated to extension activities.
I suppose this is a bit of a shift, and when it comes to thinking, you know, the changes in extension and research, the reorientation in the 80s, you know, I had worked in Alberta, where it was primarily at the time a commercial beekeeping industry, and there was, you know, the researchers in extension, and I imagine Minnesota as well, Basil Fergala and some of those figures were dealing with a commercial industry. But I guess what comes up in the 80s is the kind of a split duty for extension. There's a large component focusing on people who want to get into beekeeping as a hobby. That's a new phenomenon.
Yeah. It's interesting if we use Oregon as a paradigm. I think something like 75 to 80% of all honeybee colonies are owned by 15 people, the commercial beekeeping cadre, whereas the uncounted hundreds of others who are the hobby or non-commercial people. The non-commercial beekeeping audience tends to envelop often 80% of an extension person's time. Interesting. And also in Oregon, the commercial versus hobby beekeeping is often geographically delineated by the fact that, not so much the case now, but it used to be that the majority of commercial beekeepers were east of the Cascade Ridge. And the same would be true in the state of Washington also. So the majority of your hobby beekeepers were on the west, as we term the west side, And that's where most of the extension activities took place in terms of interacting with local bee associations, interacting with the state bee associations. For a number of years, I jokingly said that the Oregon State Bee Association could actually be called the Willamette Valley Beekeepers Association, simply the concentration of the population, hence the beekeepers on the west side.
Yeah, and I guess with the emergence of WAS as a kind of an area for people, that growing constituency to get information and to network, and the focus of new focus of extension and being able to provide resources, some basic resources on how to beekeep, is one dimension of how this collaborative work in the region developed. And I suppose, the other area would have been the commonality of the crops. So
Yes.
as you've pointed out, we have a previous episode way back where you talked about the long-standing, really unprecedented rental rate survey that you launched for crop pollination, and demonstrating that now, unlike in the past, 75% of the income, or probably more now, for commercial beekeeping comes from
Pollination
rentals. And so there's this growing, I guess that period really witnesses a transformation in the role of bees in agriculture, that bees were always used in pollination, but there is a ratcheting up of pollination and the needs of growers to be able to figure out how to effectively use bees in pollination.
Yes. We had a small project, 1983, that was funded by the Wasco County Fruit League, where we looked at colony strengths on the ground during sweet cherry pollination. And I was impressed at the time that growers were largely unaware of what a good colony of honeybees should be. And that was the incentive that led to the PNW publication on evaluating a honeybee colony for pollination, which, when I look back on it, was, quote, the best seller I ever wrote, in the sense of it had a targeted audience of growers, but also there were a number of people in the bee industry that were really unaware of some of the particulars of what makes up a biological unit that's effective in pollinating. So that publication was revised by our new, I shouldn't say new, Ramesh has been here quite a while, but Ramesh Sagili saw the wisdom in revising this, because it's been an important publication. It helps the growing community in understanding, again, just what the hell goes on inside a beehive, and what are the aspects of a bee colony for them to maximize pollination benefit. I always thought that an extension apiculturist has really a couple of target audiences. He has commercial beekeepers, he has hobby beekeepers, but an extensionist also has growers of bee-dependent crops. And easily a third of my activity when I was on the payroll was working with grower groups and discussing ways to where growers could maximize the investment they're putting in. I always called renting bees as the cheapest crop insurance you ever get, and tried to make growers realize that you're not renting bees to guarantee a crop that year. You're renting bees to guarantee against a crop failure. And when you looked at it years ago, and almonds have become an exception to this, but a grower would often be, if you look at farm gate return on an acre of crop, the amount of money a grower was spending to rent bees was usually less than 1% of the farm gate value of that crop. So that's why it was called cheap crop insurance.
Well, and I suppose that's something that we take for granted now. Growers, you don't have to convince growers of the need for bees now. and sometimes you have to hold growers back from overstocking with colonies because they've taken, this cheap crop insurance to heart.
Yeah.
But at the time, you almost had to make the case for it. I think about like the McGregor book or the John B. Free book.
Yes.
In the 80s coming out as a way to sort of make the case for pollination to agriculture.
McGregor's book, to me, is a classic.
It's wonderful.
It just, I reiterate what you just stated. It was very helpful to the academic community as well as to commercial agricultural production.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the other big area of cooperative work is pesticides, which, as you started at the beginning of the episode mentioning, predates you. That we had Bill Stevens, who did wonderful work on native bee biology, but also very practical work on alfalfa pollination, and Carl Johansson at WSU, and then Dan Mayer eventually at WSU. There is and yourself, there is a kind of hub of research on pesticides and bees that at the time was the cutting edge in the world.
Absolutely. When I came to OSU in '74, if you were to survey the commercial bee industry and say to a commercial beekeeper, what's the biggest problem you have? 99% of them would say pesticide kill.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Really? Huh.
Absolutely number one.
Okay.
Which is why Carl's work was so important, and Bill's work too. Remember, Stephen did a classic paper on looking at sublethal doses of malathion on the honeybee dance,
mm-hmm.
and found that sublethal doses were indeed interfering with communication within a beehive. But especially Carl's work led to publications, like an extension publications on the hazards of pesticides, grouping various pesticides relative to bee hazard, which gave growers and spray applicators a guide by which they could attempt to reduce colony losses.
So wait a second. This is because I have been, I've been working on the revision of of what this publication is since I got here. I still haven't got it out. But if I get this straight, this publication that was targeted at growers, providing education, giving them idea of like different pesticide options and their toxicity, that stems from the 70s? At least the 80s, of course, but
yeah, I'd say I don't know what the original date of publication of that was, but it was.
But it comes out of WSU.
Initially,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know, if you were to ask a commercial beekeeper today what are your number one problems, I think pesticide losses might not even make the Big Ten.
No, they wouldn't. I've asked them.
And another thing that came about was, and this was very interesting, there were a number of cases of beekeepers suing applicators.
Mm-hmm.
And I was involved as an expert witness in 4 cases that I can remember now. And in each instance, the beekeeper won.
Mm-hmm.
That the spraying of pesticides in those particular cases were egregious, and it was obvious, and pesticide applicators began paying attention once the legal system was saying, hey, do it right, do it right. And then the regional publication on pesticides was very, very helpful. So over time, pesticide colony losses have really become minimalized. I don't say they don't exist, but it's certainly nothing like it was 40 years ago.
So we've covered those 2 topics. So there is these 3 concerns that emerge in the 80s. the new hobby beekeepers and providing information to them, there is this focus on kind of shepherding the egg sector into seeing the value of honeybee pollination. And then there's this third focus on a concerted push, which seems to have been quite successful in educating growers and applicators on product selection, reducing these pesticide incidences. What do you see as the legacy of these kinds of programs in the present? Clearly, things have, we've kind of intonated this. At some level, they look the same. We still have hobby beekeepers, we still have pesticides, we still have crop pollination, but also things seem to have changed a lot since that time. So how do you kind of assess the legacy of that early regional cooperative approach to dealing with these problems?
One of the places I've seen it is that the quality of colonies coming from the commercial beekeeping sector has really increased. With pesticide losses and then the arrival of the parasitic mites, it took shoddy operators out of business. You had to have a rather steep learning curve if you were going to maintain a healthy colony, especially after the mites arrived. And that emphasized the importance of pollination income rental. And rental prices began a steady increase. Nowhere more highlighted than the almond industry, but all other crops shirt-tailed it. So in the survey work I was doing, and I ran this pollination survey for 25 years, the average price of a colony rental continued to increase. Though I never measured it, but you could see that commercial beekeeper operators had to be more business savvy. They had to put pencil to paper to look at cost-benefit analysis on X number of colonies going to X number of crop at this time of year. And they really began doing a better job on that. They became better businessmen and businesswomen. So again, from when I first came to today, the commercial beekeeper is more savvy, more aware, a better business person, and providing a better product, i.e., the individual honeybee colony. Is the state of Oregon for years, and we had through the Oregon Department of Agriculture, we had mandatory colony standards for pollination strength. And these went a long way in helping commercial beekeepers realize what type of product they had to put out. And conversely, it helped growers in understanding what kind of product should I be receiving. So you had more savvy growers in terms of what they wanted from a hive of bees they were running from you, and they were paying a better price. And you pointed out, as my survey showed, that over the years it ended up where a commercial beekeeper was deriving 75% of their income from pollination rental. And this is in our region, it's the best documented. But if you look at when I was teaching the introductory beekeeping class here at OSU, one of the things I always pointed out to the students was that, what's the value of the honeybee to human society? And by far and away, it's the pollination aspect. The fact that our food production systems are reliant on a pollinator that's available. People talk about alternative pollinators, but if you're growing 50 acres of sweet cherries, you don't call up 10 people who are playing with orchard mason bees to provide those bees to your orchard. You call on a competent commercial beekeeper to provide those. So the pollination, the importance of the pollination industry has always been there. The fiscal reward is what's improved over the years. And I'm delighted to see it.
I guess, maybe to conclude, one thing that seems new is that, there's a renewed interest in native bees. And certainly myself as an apiculture person who now, spends 80% of his time on wild bees is, I would not have anticipated this being somebody who was educated in the 1990s. But I guess what's often forgotten is in the region, especially here at OSU, there was a strong focus going back to the 50s or even before Herman Scullin. The apiculture position here at OSU also had there's many specimens that he collected in the Oregon State Arthropod collection that our volunteers are only now starting to rediscover. And so how have you regarded this kind of seemingly this renewed interest in native bees and maybe the ways in which this work at OSU and the region is in some ways forgotten, or maybe?
And it shouldn't be forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating to me coming to the Pacific Northwest to be in a region where there were 3 commercial bee species:
Mm-hmm.
honeybees, alfalfa leaf-cutting bees, and alkali bees.
Mm-hmm.
And both the leafcutter bee and the alkali bee target a single crop, alfalfa seed.
Mm-hmm.
But their development was through the research efforts at WSU, OSU, especially with Bill Stephen, and entire industry developed from this work. So to come here where there's, I remember going to an alfalfa, or it was an
Ford Cedar.
Yeah, it was an alfalfa seed growers convention over in Ontario. It was, probably 1975 or 1976. I was very new here. And there were 500 people at that meeting. And I was astounded to see such an interest in the pollination aspect of the crop they were growing. And here were 2 solitary bee species being managed to pollinate this one crop.
That must have been really surprising because you probably had heard a little bit of kicking the tires on alfalfa leaf-cutting bees in the literature, or you'd heard about some small experiments, but you go there and then a room full of growers shows up and is scribbling notes furiously. You know that something had really caught on.
Right.
Yeah.
And the development of those 2 species was absolutely focused from research work at WSU and OSU, and to a lesser degree, University of Nevada at Reno.
Mm-hmm.
And also Davis with Robin Thorpe's work.
Mm-hmm.
But to see commercialized non-honeybee species was just an absolute fascination for me. Now, the recent resurgence, again, comes back to the fact that the putative colony collapse disorder has made the lay public aware of how important non-apis pollination can be. Back in the 80s, Susan Batra, who was a USDA researcher back east, she wrote an article in Scientific American where she estimated that if we took honeybees out of the picture, if we eliminated all honeybees in North America, what would crop production look like? And she made the statement that it would probably reduce crop production by 50%,
Mm-hmm.
meaning 50% of pollination activities are being done by non-apis honeybees,
Mm-hmm.
or excuse me, non-apis bees. So the importance of solitary bee species has been underappreciated, and now it's more appreciated. The difficulty is in trying to commercialize these various species. But we have the success story here in the Pacific Northwest of the alkali bee and the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee,
Mm-hmm.
which
kind of mushroom came out of the ground out of nowhere.
Came out of the ground of nowhere, and as a result of some good basic research on the part of entomologists at our land grant institutions.
Actually, I remember we had an interview with Jim Kane from USDA, and he pointed out that the origins, there was people who would bring and establish it, but that in the West, people would notice where they have old barns, and the bees just kind of like nested in the boards.
Yes.
You would suddenly get good pollination. It was just like this.
Yeah.
But also just a concerted investment in the, by USDA after the 50s in developing this industry, and the researchers in the region made it happen. Well, this is great. I wanted to kind of capture this moment. I always think this possibility. The Master Melittologist program recently, we've expanded through the region, and just keeping in mind that there is this tradition of reciprocal cooperation between the states and British Columbia in the region that goes back a ways.
Indeed it does.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn, Sin, and Neil, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.